China on the High Seas, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. Control of the sea lanes has historically held a high place on the list of strategic priorities of great powers. Economic prosperity has long been linked to maritime strength, and so it remains, particularly for ambitious nations dependent on distant sources of energy and other commodities. It's perhaps not surprising, then, that China's rise has fostered a desire on the part of Beijing to enhance its ability to project maritime power. To help us understand the strategic implications of China's nautical muscle flexing for Asia and beyond, we're joined by James Holmes, Associate Professor of Strategy at the Naval War College. Before joining the Naval War College faculty in 2007, he served on the faculty of the University of Georgia School of Public and International Affairs. A former U.S. Navy surface warfare officer, he served on the battleship Wisconsin. His books include the forthcoming A Powerful People's Navy, China's Rise and the U.S. Maritime Strategy. James Holmes, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks, Doug.
Well, I'm wondering, we don't often in our discussions of China think of China's Navy as a significant force. Could you give us a little background on the People's Liberation Army Navy, as it's known?
Well, part of the reason we don't think about China's Navy so much is because China has been absent from the seas for literally centuries. Back in the Ming Dynasty in the 15th century, China possessed the biggest, the most technologically advanced, the most fearsome navy in the entire world. There was a series of voyages in Southeast Asia and South Asia under the famed Admiral Zheng He for purposes of diplomacy and exploration and so forth. After those voyages ceased in the 1430s, the Ming emperors ordered that navy broken up, and they forbade the maintenance of naval forces for the duration of the Ming Dynasty. Only in the Qing Dynasty later on, 19th century and so forth, did China re-enter the seas. And even then, it wasn't a serious naval player. In 1894 and 95, the Imperial Japanese Navy, an up-and-coming fleet, crushed the Qing Navy and essentially ended Chinese sea power until the advent of the People's Republic of China. Now, for Mao Zedong, with whom we're all familiar, Mao was very dismissive of maritime pursuits. He kept his eyes firmly locked on events ashore, not only because that's where China's threats to Chinese security have always emanated from Central Asia and so forth, but also because with the rift between China and the Soviet Union provided the main threat axis. That the Chinese had to think about that. They simply didn't have the resources or the interest in looking at the seas. But China is back. I think the United States military, and especially the naval establishment, has been very slow to take the Chinese Navy seriously, and I think that's a mistake. If we think back to past naval powers, the Meiji Restoration in Japan took place in 1868. Well, if you flash forward 3 decades from there, by 1898, the Japanese Navy has thrashed the Chinese Navy, and it's within a few years of thrashing the Russian Navy and establishing itself as the master of maritime Asia. The U.S. in 1883 started building its first steam-driven Navy. 30 years, think ahead 30 years from there. In 1913, the Great White Fleet's been around the world, and the fleet stands on the verge of being a Navy second to none, if you think about what President Woodrow Wilson said about it. So it can be done, and I think that the U.S. Navy has been slow to rid itself of preconceptions formed during the 1950s when the PLA Navy was a coastal defense force that hugged the shores and posed little threat to U.S. control of the sea lanes in East Asia.
So, you talk about that transition from a coastal defense force to what it is now. What kind of capacity do we see right now?
Well, we see a fleet that has tailored itself essentially in what defense specialists call to asymmetric warfare. what happened in the mid-1990s, Taiwan obviously is the immediate priority for China in foreign policy and in military terms. During the 1995 and 1996 Taiwanese electoral campaign, Beijing feared that Taipei was about to elect a government that would take that island down the pathway to formal independence, and it was something clearly unacceptable to China. So it conducted missile-to-missile tests to the east and to the west of the island in order to deter the Taiwanese from electing the wrong president. What the Clinton administration did was dispatch 2 carrier battle groups to that area. This humiliated the Chinese military, because not only could they not target or dissuade these American forces from operating in the area, but they could not even locate them. In effect, the leadership in Beijing said never again, and they set out to study closely the U.S. Navy and the U.S. military, find out what we're strong at, find out what we're not so strong at, and tailor their forces to strike at weaknesses in our own naval strategy. Just one small example: after the end of the Cold War, I think there was the naval forces heaved a sigh of relief. There was no more submarine threat to worry about. We didn't have to worry about Soviet submarines roaming the Atlantic to the Pacific and creating havoc that way. So what you saw was a kind of atrophy in the submarine service, not only in terms of numbers of submarines, but also in the exercise of the skills and doctrine needed to pursue anti-submarine warfare. So what have the Chinese done? They've gone out and they've developed a rather impressive force of conventional submarines, very useful for operating in the China seas just offshore, and they've also pressed ahead with a force of nuclear submarines, which is far more capable than certainly than anything Mao Zedong China would have envisioned. So essentially they've done a very wise thing, and they've tailored their forces to strike at American weaknesses.
And what traditionally has been the role of the Seventh Fleet? I mean, the U.S. role in what they would consider their backyard.
Well, one thing, if you think about how a dominant power, a dominant sea power functions in the world, and it's not true just of ourselves, but also of the Royal Navy before us during its era of British naval mastery. Obviously, navies they serve the political interests of their own nations. That's what instruments of military power do. But in a real sense, a dominant navy also performs essentially renders an international public good, namely maritime security, keeping the sea lanes clear of not only hostile fleets, but of also non-state actors like we have the counter-piracy operation going on now off Somalia. The Proliferation Security Initiative is a consortium of nations that tries to interrupt shipments of the building blocks of weapons of mass destruction in transit. All of these sorts of things are potential menaces to free navigation. So a dominant navy like the U.S. Navy, in pursuit of its everyday activities, in a very real sense, provides something that's of use to all nations that value the sea. It's important to note that 90% of world trade by volume goes by sea, simply because there's no other economical way to transport large quantities of oil or minerals or gas or this sort of thing. So everybody with a stake in globalization has a stake in free navigation. This is what the U.S. Navy has provided for the past 60 years or so, since 1945. So
if you're a smaller, less ambitious nation, you're happy to be a free rider and let someone else play that role. But if you have wider aspirations, like we assume China does, you might want to have a role in that sort of policing function. What do we see in terms of, you mentioned the situation of piracy off the Somali coast. Are the Chinese involved there?
They are, and indeed, you raised an interesting point, which I'll address before I go on to the piracy question. I think if you are a lesser power, and if you are accustomed to free riding on the maritime security provided by a hegemonic power, to use international relations speak, but then you develop vital national interests at sea yourself, as China has in importing energy supplies from South Asia and from Africa and so forth. Then it all of a sudden looks like that dominant naval power then has a chokehold, or it has a potential trump card to play against you if something happens in Taiwan, or if some other contingency comes up. The U.S. can essentially hold Chinese interests at risk.
So the policeman becomes
asymmetrically. So it's an asymmetry on a grand scale. Now, with regard to the piracy question, yes, the Chinese, and I actually take comfort in the Chinese deployment off of Somalia in the Gulf of Aden. Essentially, and there's a hodgepodge of naval contingents policing the Gulf of Aden. Essentially, what they're trying to do is keep open a transit corridor, keep that clear of pirates, in hopes that ships can make the journey without being molested. The Chinese have. They've been on station since December 2008, early 2009. They clearly do not accept operational control from the United States or from any of the multinational groups that are operating in the area, and they've also confined themselves to convoying Chinese flagships, ships sailing under the Chinese flag, carrying commodities to Chinese users. Now, that's the downside. The upside is that the Chinese have occasionally made noises, especially in recent weeks, about operating more closely with the EU flotilla. The European Union is also engaged in its first naval outing as the EU, not under NATO auspices. So I think we see some signs that the Chinese are willing to assume this sort of joint trusteeship role over maritime security, and I think the jury's still out, but I'm encouraged by what I see taking place in that operation.
So that's on the plus side of the ledger. Presumably, one of the things an aspiring power would want is to have a more exclusive role in policing its own neighborhood. So, what do you think at this point? There's ambition for pushing the 7th Fleet out of the Pacific, or at least the portion of Pacific that's of interest to China?
It's an interesting question, and it's a big question. I don't think we're going to settle it in a short discussion. But as far as pushing the 7th Fleet out of the region, I think that perhaps states it a little too starkly. That makes it a very zero-sum competition, when in fact that might not necessarily be the case that China's naval gains become setbacks for the United States. China has set out, I believe, to establish what we in the strategic studies community call a contested zone. In essence, and to put this in sort of everyday parlance, nations operating close to their own shores have a kind of home field advantage. They have bases nearby. They have short communications with the theater of action, and so on and so forth. So even against a power as dominant as the United States that is operating across thousands of miles of Pacific waters, China can hope to gain a measure of influence over the China Seas out to the first island chain, and perhaps even beyond. Which I think probably leaves the onus on the United States to start thinking ahead about its policy in Asia. Can the United States accept partial command of Asian waters? What does a maritime partnership with China really mean? I mean, we talk in grand terms about fashioning some sort of consortium, but what in real terms does that mean? I mean, how does it actually work when you try to put it into practice? I think it's absolutely key and essential that we concede that China does, by virtue of its power status and its historic role in China or in Asia, I think it does deserve, and I think it will have a leadership role in maritime Asia. But beyond that, I'm not sure exactly how the details work.
Okay, well, we'll leave it right there. Now we're going to take a short break. To our viewers, we'll be right back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about China's maritime prowess with James Holmes from the Naval War College. I'd like to turn, if we could, to how this plays out regionally. What are some of China's neighbors thinking as they look off the coast and see a growing Chinese Navy? Let's start with a very close traditional U.S. ally in the last half a century, Japan.
Well, yeah, that's the $64,000 question: is where is Japan going now that they've had a changeover, really for the first time in many years, in the leadership from the Liberal Democratic Party to the Democratic Party of Japan. There have been some worrisome signs within the U.S.-Japan alliance, which, as you say, it can also be almost be considered a strategic unit in East Asia. But Japan has moved to end the refueling mission in the Indian Ocean, which it's been pursuing with the war on terror since September 11th almost. So there are some signs of tension within the alliance bilaterally. Now, with regard to China, I think that there are at least two issues that are probably worth mentioning for our audience. First, I think there are direct frictions between China and Japan over undersea resources in the East China Sea. Both sides have pointed to international law just as powers will tend to do. They've picked the version of international law that would give them the biggest chunk of the undersea resources simply by drawing the lines between China and Japan. With regard to their exclusive economic zones. So that's out there. I don't foresee that spilling into certainly not into war. But there have been frictions and some troubling circumstances in which Chinese planes have trained guns on Japanese vessels and so forth. So that's one potential irritant. The other is the status of Taiwan, the elephant in the room. Clearly, Beijing's immediate priority is to recover Taiwan. The Chinese Communist regime has depended ever since its inception just over 60 years ago on recovering every inch of ground Imperial China lost to foreign conquerors in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And clearly Taiwan is a big piece of that. So for reasons of national pride, and also for strategic reasons, Beijing has clearly set out to, that's just non-negotiable for the Chinese. If you look at your map, and if you think of it, try to put yourself in Japanese shoes, and if you assume that Taiwan does indeed return to Chinese rule, then essentially China has pushed its waters, its territorial seas, well out into the Pacific, turning Japan's southern flank and asserting some control, assuming the PLA stations forces on the island, asserting some control over sea lanes that not only China but also Japan depends on. If you ask any Japanese citizen to describe their country to you, they will say, we're a small island, resource-poor nation dependent on the sea for imports of goods in order to sustain our economic health. So that's clearly a vital interest for the Japanese. So I think that the Taiwan situation, I think it really engages Japanese interests as well as our own. So I guess those are probably the two things that stand out in my mind as far as Japan goes.
Well, and the other rising global power, of course, in the region is India. Now, India has its own naval interests in the region, does it not?
It does. If you look around to the south, there's been a debate in China, really reaching back to the 1980s, about what direction a naval China, a Chinese sea power, should look in. The early thinking was that the Chinese Navy would pursue a phased buildup, looking out eastward across the Pacific to compete with the United States Navy for global influence and so forth. I think economic interests have beckoned China's interest to the South China Sea and to South Asia simply because of the urgent need to pursue economic development, secure the legitimacy of the regime, and essentially raise the standard of living for the Chinese populace. This is a matter of life and death for the Chinese regime, with the appeal of communism in free fall. So yeah, so I think this definitely focuses Chinese interests in waters that India considers its own. These names count. Iran makes a big deal about the Persian Gulf being the Persian Gulf, and in the same sense, the Indian Ocean is the Indian Ocean in Indian eyes. So yes, and India sees itself as the natural, much as our own nation did back in the Monroe Doctrine era, sees itself as the leader of a non-aligned bloc of nations, especially in South Asia, and it certainly frowns on Chinese pretensions should the Chinese pursue a naval presence in the region. So yes, you definitely see some interaction going on out at sea, and India pursuing a blue water fleet and so forth.
Well, we talked a little bit about just the sense of a rising power should have a naval capacity that befits a rising power. What are the real economic strategic interests in China's growing naval capacity? I mean, how much is just national pride and how much is actual life and death economic necessity?
Well, actually, you raised two points again. I think the first one is worth exploring just briefly before I move on to the main thrust of the question. It is certainly true, as you look around the world at rising sea powers, that they think that certain naval platforms, certain ship types, go with being great powers, and there's people in my field of work have been debating for many years about whether China would seek an aircraft carrier. If you ask the Chinese, they would probably tell you that China will seek an aircraft carrier because every other member of the UN Security Council has them, as well as other powers like Thailand. If Thailand has a carrier and China doesn't, I mean that seems ludicrous to many Chinese eyes. So yeah, there are certainly reasons of national prestige and I think in this sense China's vision of itself, I think, propelling China in to pursue these platforms. As far as the economic question goes, I think the Chinese do see a vital interest at stake in maritime security. As I said before, I think they see the United States increasingly as having a chokehold over their oil supplies. And as I said, economic development is job number one for Beijing. If the current rates of economic growth falter, you might see more unrest along the populace, and ultimately, I guess the fear is the entire system might unravel. So I think they're sincere. I think they're quite sincere about this. With regard to energy supplies and resource supplies, one interesting thing to note about the Chinese is simply that they take a more mercantilist view of these things. They're not willing to, they're less willing to go out and simply purchase these things on the open market the way we think about doing. As they go into Africa, as they manage relations with the Gulf states and so forth, they like to seek out contracts that will essentially guarantee supplies come what may. So if you do that, and if you do other things that they have been doing, like building a national tanker fleet, a fleet of tankers under Chinese government control, then it starts looking like you need a fleet able to convoy these things should things go south with the United States or with India or with some other future rival.
Well, let's go back to where we started with the potential flashpoint of Taiwan. You know, we mentioned President Clinton's response to Chinese missile tests, if you will. Were that to happen again today, if it looked like it could ramp up to actual military action on the part of the mainland against Taiwan, given the state of the U.S.'s posture at this point, do you think it would be likely or feasible for the U.S. to have a military response, given this more robust Chinese Navy?
Oh, I think that's a great question. I think that's a great question. I think that Beijing's strategy, its diplomacy, and its use of other implements of power is simply, I think it's set on creating such doubts and inducing hesitation in President Obama or some future president in a time of crisis. What I think the Chinese would like to do is, well, I mean, all nations like to win to get what they want without fighting, and I think that's certainly a staple of Chinese strategic thought all the way back to the days of Sun Tzu 2,500 years ago. I think that what they would like to do is create the perception among the United States that Taiwan doesn't matter to U.S. interests. They would like to loosen the democratic bond between us that links us, could dissuade us of the geostrategic value of the island and so forth, and at the same time threaten to impose such high costs on the United States military that any future president, it simply wouldn't be worth the effort. Carl von Clausewitz, I have to mention Clausewitz because I'm a War College guy, he proposed a simple equation for looking at things like this. He said that the value of the political objective drives the magnitude and the duration of the effort a state is willing to put into securing that effort. Well, if you raise the costs, if you raise the apparent magnitude and the apparent duration of the military effort that would be required to defend Taiwan to sufficiently high, sooner or later it's going to be way out of joint with the value of the political object for the United States, which by that logic would dissuade the United States from getting involved.
Well, assuming, as we all hope, it doesn't come to that, just the normal evolution and development of Chinese naval capacity would require some sort of response on the part of the U.S. What, in your view, should that be?
Well, I mean, military affairs is a continuous process of interaction. So clearly, the Chinese are doing certain things. I mentioned this. I mentioned the submarine fleet. They are reportedly, and I remain skeptical about this particular platform, but they are reportedly developing an anti-ship ballistic missile with a 1,500-mile range that would be able to target U.S. battle groups way out to sea. If you think about 1,500 miles, that's all the way out to Guam. That would clearly, if that system were to come to fruition, then that would clearly be a game changer. As my friend, as one of my friends at the War College has written, he called this a game changer in the Asia Pacific. So trying to come to terms with that, figure out a way to shield the carrier strike groups from such missile attack. Clearly, the technological aspect should not be underestimated.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. There's always more to say,
Yeah,
but
always.
James Holmes, U.S. Naval War College, thank you very much. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.